The Soviet Union collapsed in December 1991, but the country that would cease to exist was already unrecognizable by the beginning of 1990. In January of that year, Soviet troops opened fire on protesters in Baku, Azerbaijan, killing at least 137 civilians in a single night of violence that would have been unthinkable just 2 years earlier. What had happened inside the world's largest country to transform it from apparent superpower stability into a disintegrating empire where the central government was shooting its own citizens in multiple republics simultaneously? The first thing you would have noticed if you had walked through Moscow in January 1990 was the absence of basic goods. Not shortage, absence. The shelves in state stores displayed rows of identical cans with labels that promised fish or vegetables, but when customers asked, the clerks would shake their heads. The cans were empty, placed there for appearance. Lines formed before dawn outside any shop rumored to have received butter, soap, or meat. People carried string bags called avoski, whose name derived from the Russian word for maybe because you never knew what you might find. The average Muscovite spent between 2 and 4 hours per day standing in queues. In provincial cities, the situation was far worse. Rationing cards had returned to Sverdlovsk, Leningrad, and dozens of other cities, something not seen since the Second World War. Citizens received coupons for sugar, tea, vodka, and cigarettes. The communist system that had promised abundance had instead delivered scarcity so profound that it permeated every waking hour. But the economy was only the most visible symptom of a deeper unraveling. The Soviet political system was experiencing something unprecedented: simultaneous loss of control from above and dissolution of belief from below. Mikhail Gorbachev had introduced glasnost, or openness, in 1986, intending to allow controlled criticism that would strengthen the system by exposing inefficiency. By 1990, glasnost had become something entirely different. TV programs now broadcast documentaries about Stalin's purges, featuring survivors describing the torture chambers of the NKVD. Newspapers published accounts of the secret protocols in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the 1939 agreement with Nazi Germany that the Soviet government had denied existed for 50 years. Each revelation destroyed another pillar of official history. If the state had lied about the pact with Hitler, what else was false? If Lenin's secret police had committed atrocities, what legitimacy remained? If you're watching this, you're clearly someone who wants to understand how political systems actually fall apart, not just the simplified version. That puts you in rare company. We publish new investigations into Soviet and Cold War history every week, uncovering the mechanics behind the moments that shape the modern world. Subscribe now so you don't miss them. The Communist Party itself was fracturing. In February 1990, the Central Committee voted to end the party's constitutional monopoly on power, the very principle that had defined the Soviet state since 1917. This was not a decision made freely. Mass demonstrations had erupted in Moscow: democracy, democracy, democracy. In Lithuania, the independence movement Sojudis had won overwhelming control of the Supreme Soviet in elections held just weeks earlier. In Estonia and Latvia, similar movements had taken power. Gorbachev faced an impossible choice: use force to maintain the monopoly and risk civil war, or surrender the monopoly and watch the system dissolve legally. He chose dissolution, believing he could manage the transition. He could not. The Soviet Union in 1990 was 15 republics bound together by force, ideology, and economic integration, and all three bonds were simultaneously failing. The force question came first. In April 1989, Soviet troops had used sharpened spades to kill 19 protesters in Tbilisi, Georgia. The brutality shocked the country. Officers had been given orders to disperse a peaceful demonstration, and they had interpreted those orders as permission for massacre. When details emerged, public outrage forced investigations. But the investigations revealed something more disturbing. The chain of command was unclear. Local commanders claimed Moscow had authorized force. Moscow officials claimed local authorities had requested intervention. The truth was that decision-making structures were breaking down. No one knew who could order violence, who would obey, or who would be held accountable afterward. The ideological bond had already snapped. Communist Party membership, once a prerequisite for professional advancement, had become a liability. In the March 1990 elections for Republic and local Soviets, reformist candidates campaigned explicitly against the party and won stunning victories. In Moscow, Leningrad, and Kiev, party officials lost seats they had held for decades. Boris Yeltsin, who had been expelled from the Politburo in 1987 for criticizing the pace of reform, won election to the Russian Republic's Supreme Soviet with a landslide. In May, he was elected chairman of the Russian Supreme Soviet, making him in effect the president of Russia, a position that now rivaled Gorbachev's authority. Here was the paradox. The Soviet Union contained a republic called Russia, and Russia was now developing its own government separate from the Soviet government. Gorbachev was president of the USSR. Yeltsin was leader of Russia, which held authority in Moscow itself. Economic integration, the final bond, was collapsing into what economists would later call the Republic's war of laws. The Soviet economy had been designed as a single organism. Factories in Ukraine produced components shipped to assembly plants in Belarus, which sent finished goods to distributors in Kazakhstan. The system worked only if central planners in Moscow coordinated the entire chain. But in 1990, republic governments began passing laws claiming ownership of resources and factories on their territory. Estonia declared that its laws superseded Soviet laws. Russia followed. So did Ukraine. Suddenly, coal mines in Donetsk did not know whether they answered to Kiev, to Moscow, or to the workers' councils that were forming in the mines themselves. The Donbas coal miners went on strike in the summer of 1989 and again in 1990, demanding not just higher wages, but political change. These were not dissidents or intellectuals. These were the proletariat, the workers in whose name the entire system claimed legitimacy, and they were rejecting the system entirely. Walk into a Soviet factory in 1990 and you would find a strange scene. Workers showed up, clocked in, and performed tasks, but production had become almost theoretical. The factory might produce electronic components, but the factory that needed those components in Minsk had stopped sending the raw materials, because the Belarusian government had requisitioned those materials for domestic use. The Moscow factory's director would call ministry officials, who would issue orders that were ignored. Meanwhile, the workers were paid in rubles that bought less each month. Inflation was officially 5% in 1990, but that figure was meaningless because state stores had nothing to sell at state prices. The real economy had moved to black and grey markets where prices were 10 or 20 times higher. Factory managers began bartering finished goods directly with other factories, bypassing the state distribution system entirely. The planned economy was decomposing into localized fiefdoms. The nationalities question, always the most dangerous in Soviet politics, was now an open crisis. The USSR contained more than 100 distinct ethnic groups. The Soviet solution had been to create a federal structure with ethnically defined republics, then suppress any real nationalism through party control and secret police. By 1990, the party's control was gone and the KGB was increasingly uncertain whether it could or should act. In the Caucasus, violence had become routine. Armenia and Azerbaijan were fighting over Nagorno-Karabakh, an Armenian-majority region inside Azerbaijan. Troops had been deployed, but they could not stop the killings. In January 1990, anti-Armenian pogroms in Baku killed dozens. The Soviet government sent tanks into the city, imposing martial law and killing more than 100 Azerbaijanis in the process. The intervention solved nothing. Armenians in Karabakh declared independence from Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan declared the declaration illegal. Moscow had no answer. The Baltic republics presented a different challenge. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania had been independent countries between 1918 and 1940, when the Soviet Union occupied them under the secret protocols of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The Balts had never accepted Soviet rule as legitimate, and Glasnost allowed them to say so publicly. By 1990, all three republics had popular fronts that controlled their governments and were preparing for full independence. Lithuania moved first. On March 11, 1990, the Lithuanian Supreme Soviet declared independence. Gorbachev declared the declaration illegal and imposed an economic blockade, cutting off fuel supplies. The crisis dragged on for weeks. Gorbachev could not allow Lithuania to leave, because if one republic left, others would follow. But he could not use the level of force necessary to suppress Lithuanian independence without destroying his reputation in the West and triggering condemnation that would end the economic assistance the USSR desperately needed. So he applied pressure, negotiated and delayed, hoping something would change. Nothing changed. The economy kept deteriorating. Soviet GDP declined by approximately 2% in 1990, the first peacetime contraction in decades. Industrial production fell. Agricultural output dropped despite a decent harvest, because the distribution system was failing. Goods produced in factories never reached stores. Grain sat in warehouses while cities went hungry, not because of shortage, but because of logistical collapse. The government printed more money to cover budget deficits, which accelerated inflation. Economists inside the government knew the system was approaching freefall. In the spring of 1990, a group of reformist economists led by Grigory Yavlinsky developed a plan called 500 Days, which proposed rapid transition to a market economy. The plan was radical: privatize state enterprises, free prices, break up monopolies, all within 500 days. Gorbachev initially supported the plan, then hesitated, then commissioned alternative plans, then tried to merge incompatible proposals into a compromise that satisfied no one. In the end, he implemented nothing. The moment for managed economic transition passed. Travel outside Moscow in 1990, and the Soviet Union revealed itself as an empire in dissolution. In Central Asia, the communist bosses who had run the republics for decades still held power, but their authority now rested on nationalism rather than ideology. They had transformed themselves from Soviet administrators into ethnic leaders, claiming to protect Uzbek or Kazakh interests against Moscow. In Moldova, the Popular Front had won elections and was moving toward independence, while the Russian-speaking population in Transnistria began forming armed militias to resist Moldovan rule. The Soviet state was fracturing along every possible fault line simultaneously: ethnic, economic, political, and geographic. The military, once the bedrock of Soviet power, was itself confused and divided. Officers had spent their careers training to fight NATO, but now they were deployed against Soviet citizens in Soviet cities. The mission was unclear, and the rules of engagement were incoherent. Some officers refused orders to shoot civilians. Others followed orders and then faced criminal investigations. Conscripts, who served 2-year terms, were increasingly from the non-Russian republics, and their loyalty to the Soviet state was questionable. In some units, soldiers from the Baltics or the Caucasus refused to participate in operations against protesters from their own republics. The institutional cohesion that had made the Soviet military a superpower force was eroding from within. Gorbachev himself seemed trapped by contradictions of his own creation. He had introduced reforms to save the communist system, but the reforms had unleashed forces that were destroying it. He wanted a renewed Soviet Union based on voluntary federation, but the republics wanted independence. He wanted economic restructuring within socialism, but the economy required capitalism to function. He wanted to maintain the USSR's status as a superpower, but that required resources the country no longer had. By late 1990, Gorbachev was isolated. Reformers considered him too conservative. Hardliners considered him a traitor. Republic leaders ignored him. He held multiple titles: President of the USSR, General Secretary of the Communist Party, but the power those titles represented was evaporating. Look at the daily life of an ordinary Soviet citizen in November 1990, and the surreal nature of the collapse becomes clear. The television news broadcasts stories about the government's plans for economic reform and negotiations with republic leaders, as if normal governance was occurring. But when you turned off the television and walked outside, you entered a different reality. The state stores were empty, the ruble was losing value, your neighbors were hoarding food. Crime was increasing because police were overwhelmed and demoralized. If you lived in a non-Russian republic, you heard nationalist rhetoric daily, talk of independence and sovereignty and historical grievances. If you were Russian living in a non-Russian republic, you began to wonder whether you would become a foreigner in the place you had always called home. The future was completely uncertain. The winter of 1990 brought both literal and metaphorical cold. Fuel shortages meant heating was unreliable. In some cities, hot water was available only a few hours per day. Factories shut down for lack of coal or oil. The state budget was collapsing under the weight of subsidies to inefficient enterprises and payments to restive republics. Foreign currency reserves were nearly exhausted. The USSR was approaching default on foreign debt. Western governments debated whether to provide emergency assistance, but they faced their own doubts. Would aid stabilize the Soviet Union or simply delay inevitable collapse? Would money given to Moscow ever reach the people who needed it, or would it disappear into the bureaucratic void? Meanwhile, the Communist Party hemorrhaged members. In 1990 alone, approximately 4 million people quit the party. These were not purges or expulsions. These were voluntary resignations by people who no longer believed. The party elite watched the exodus with alarm but had no response. The Central Committee still met and passed resolutions, but fewer people cared. Power was migrating to new institutions: republic governments, newly elected Soviets, even street movements and strike committees. The party, which had controlled every aspect of Soviet life for 7 decades, discovered it was becoming irrelevant. In December 1990, Eduard Shevardnadze, Gorbachev's foreign minister and one of the architects of Glasnost, resigned. In his resignation speech to the Congress of People's Deputies, he warned that dictatorship was approaching. He did not specify what he meant, but everyone understood. Hardliners in the military, the KGB, and the party apparatus were advocating force. They believed the chaos could be stopped only through crackdown, a return to authoritarian control. Shevardnadze's resignation was a signal that the internal struggle for the USSR's future had reached a critical point. Gorbachev was under immense pressure to choose: continue reform and watch the Union dissolve, or restore order through violence and abandon everything Glasnost represented. The year ended with the Soviet Union still existing on maps but barely functioning in reality. The Union Treaty that was supposed to create a new voluntary federation remained unfinished. The economic crisis deepened. Republic governments continued passing laws that contradicted Soviet laws. Ethnic violence continued in the Caucasus and Central Asia, and ordinary citizens, exhausted by shortages, uncertainty, and fear, simply tried to survive. They stocked food when they could find it. They made plans to leave or plans to stay. They watched the news for signs of what would happen next, knowing that no one, not Gorbachev, not the reformers, not the hardliners, actually controlled events anymore. The Soviet Union in 1990 was a state and technical operation, but existential collapse. The institutions still existed. The borders still appeared on maps. The government still issued decrees. But the animating force was gone. No one believed in the ideology. No one trusted the institutions. No one was certain the country would exist in a year. This was not sudden chaos. It was slow-motion disintegration, a superpower coming apart in full view of its own population and the entire world. The country that had defeated Nazi Germany, that had launched the first satellite and the first man into space, that had competed with the United States for global dominance, was now struggling to feed its own people and hold its own territory. The collapse, when it came in 1991, would surprise many outsiders, but anyone paying attention in 1990 could see the end approaching. This channel is supported entirely by viewers who believe this kind of detailed historical investigation matters. If you'd like to help us keep making these documentaries, there's a Ko-fi link in the description where you can contribute. What made 1990 so significant in Soviet history was that it was the year when collapse became irreversible but not yet complete, the year when the old system had died but the new one had not yet been born. It was a year of living in between, of watching structures built over 70 years come apart in months, of experiencing the strange combination of fear and possibility that comes when everything stable becomes uncertain. The lesson, if there is one, is that great powers do not usually fall to external conquest. They disintegrate from within when their populations stop believing in the systems that govern them, when economic dysfunction meets political paralysis, when the distance between official narrative and lived reality becomes unbridgeable. The Soviet Union in 1990 was all of those things at once: a warning written in breadlines and empty stores and parliaments debating sovereignty, a warning that power without legitimacy is only temporary, and that even the largest empire is only as strong as the belief that holds it together.